This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is An Event, Perhaps, a biography of Jacques Derrida by Peter Salmon. For some, he is the originator of a relativist philosophy responsible for the contemporary crisis of truth. For the far right, he is one of the architects of cultural Marxism. To his academic critics, he reduced French philosophy to little more than an object of ridicule. For his fans, he is an intellectual rock star who ranged across literature, politics, and linguistics. In An Event, Perhaps, Peter Salmon presents this misunderstood and misappropriated figure as a deeply humane and urgent thinker for our times. An Event, Perhaps, a biography of Jacques Derrida by Peter Salmon, out now from Verso Books. I am taking a week off to play catch-up, and so I'm posting an early Dig episode that people keep returning to time and again. My interview with Barbara and Karen Fields, the authors of Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I'll be back next week with a new episode. You can find our entire archive, organized by topic and by guest, at thedigradio.com. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/thedig. And lastly, please do take a quick minute. Think of a friend who you think would like this podcast, then hit them up and suggest that they take a listen. Imagine there are people all over the place who could be Dig listeners, but who have never even heard of the podcast. A total tragedy. Okay, I do hate listening to myself from 3 years back, but here we go. Dig episode 75 from December 13th, 2017. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This year, Gallup reported findings from a poll headlined, Americans' Worries About Race Relations at Record High. The framework of race relations has long troubled me because it implies that the problems with race in America are based in some unfortunate interpersonal, communications-based lack of understanding, rather than in racism and the capitalist order that racism helps maintain. Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, opened my eyes to the fact that this race relations framework should be disturbing on an even more basic level. Race relations, after all, presumes that there are distinct entities called races: white, black, Asian, native, and maybe even Hispanic. The idea of race, Racecraft shows, is rooted in the practice of racism and the eugenicist bio-racist notion that something, whether it be blood or genes, has created a set of scientifically distinct groupings of people. My guests today are the authors of this seminal book, the brilliant sister duo comprised of historian Barbara Fields and sociologist Karen Fields. They make a persuasive case that our continuing commitment to the very idea of race helps perpetuate and strengthen racism. It also, of course, bolsters capitalism by placing a huge obstacle in the way of working people realizing their common interest in coming together to fight their bosses. Briefly, before we get started, we are on our way to meeting our goal of 700 supporters on patreon.com for 2017. When we started this podcast about a year ago, we had no clue whether it would be a financially viable endeavor. Thanks to your support, it is on track to being just that. Once it is just that, we'd also like to make some big investments in improving guest audio quality. So if you haven't done so yet, please take a moment and make a contribution at patreon.com/thedig. That's patreon.com/thedig. Thanks, and here is the show. Barbara and Karen Fields, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you very much.
And I want to start by asking you to lay out the central argument of your book in some detail. I'm going to take a stab at it first, a nutshell stab at it, and see if I get it right. Racecraft, doing its work in the shadows, naturalizes and reifies the objective, visible existence of race. And race is a prerequisite for racism, but it's the action or practice of racism that is really the motor and at the historical roots of race. Do I have that close to right?
There's some problems there, and one of them is your statement that race is a prerequisite for racism. It's the other way around. Racism being an action, it is acting on a double standard based on ascribed or putative ancestry. Racism, in other words, it's not an attitude, it's not bigotry or prejudice, it is an act. And it is the repetition of the acts of racism that makes race look like a real entity. And that is what has happened in American history.
The term racecraft, which is your coinage, describes that overall relationship between racism and race?
Let me try this one. Racecraft encompasses the fact that the race that's pictured by the subjects as real, in fact, is not, is made to be real and envisioned collectively as something real. And so people begin to think, I have a racial identity, I am a black person or a white person, I have certain characteristics, I'm smart, I deserve to be on the bottom, and so on. These things are programmed in to people through the activity of doing that first thing, acts that ostensibly based on heritage, that put somebody in his or her place.
Yeah, so the way I sometimes explain this to my students is that if you see a sideshow, my students have never seen a carnival sideshow, so I have to explain what that is. But then I tell them that there used to be, as part of carnival sideshows, an act where a magician would cut a woman in two, and it was all done with mirrors and so on. But it looked real, and the audience was spellbound by it. But at the end of the show, the lady would come back on stage along with the magician so that everybody could see that the thing was a conjuring trick. What I tell my students is that racecraft is a conjuring trick that doesn't need a conjurer on stage, because the onlookers' minds are also conjuring the spectacle for them. And racecraft doesn't end with the performer and the illusion appearing on the stage in their rightful being. Racecraft is a permanent illusion. So, and it can be a death-dealing illusion. One of the examples or groups of examples that we keep coming back to in racecraft is that of the police officer, an Afro-American police officer, or in a few instances, a Latino police officer, who is mistaken for a criminal by fellow police officers. And that is an act of, it is a consequence of racecraft that can end with someone's death. Because what happens is that a police officer who knows himself to be a police officer appears to be a black man to another police officer, who then carries out an execution.
And then one of the way that sort of incident is popularly understood is that the person is killed because of his skin color. And you both write about how that transfers the action of racism from the perpetrator to its object or victim.
Exactly.
Yes, I think that's one of our main points, that race transforms the act of a perpetrator into a characteristic of the target. Race transforms one person's action into another person's being. And we see this happening every day. And people who are the targets participate in it as well, because they can't help it. It's not a voluntary action. It is part of what we're engulfed in, because we live in the kind of society where racist action is our reality.
I would like to tag on to that people may experience it in a way that they take ownership of it. They believe that they are what Racecraft makes them. Race is an identification and an attaching of a label, a name, or a description to somebody. It's not identity, the person, him or herself, but it quickly has that transmogrification in thinking about my identity as a black woman, when I have an identity that's not as a black woman, that says Karen Fields, and that, I think, comes first.
Yeah, and you see it clearly in an episode that was before probably most of your listening audience was born. But an immigrant from Guinea in New York City was shot by the New York City police, and because the police were looking for a black rapist, and they saw this man
Amadou Diallo.
Amadou Diallo. I don't know if that name means anything to most of your audience. And the newspapers talked about it afterward. The well-intentioned press talked about it as something that had happened to him because of his identity, which couldn't have been more wrong. His identity had nothing to do with being a black man, as the police probably identified him. He probably thought, if he didn't think of himself as a Guinean, he may have thought of himself as a Malenke or whatever his people were. That's how he thought of himself, but it didn't make any difference. The police officer's identification of him was what controlled the moment, not his identity as he defined it. And that is one of the characteristics of racism. Even though the targets may imagine that their race is their identity, but in fact it's an identification, and they can choose to identify, others identify them, but racism determines that one can override the other.
One thing that you two write about is how deeply held this belief, or really ideology, is that even amongst avowed opponents of racism, there's this idea that racism is prejudice related to something objective called race, that's the source of racism. Mm-hmm. How does that thinking play into liberal anti-racism?
Part of it has to do with the liberal anti-racists evacuating the class content of American society, so that they can talk about race and racism in a vacuum. And as soon as you do it that way, you're in a self-defeating cycle, because then you have the people you've identified as a race who are permanent targets and victims, but they have no access to politics. You don't even conceive it as a political situation. And that's one of the things I see going on today with the overdevelopment, the exploding of whiteness into an all-encompassing something that really makes politics and history disappear.
Whiteness has become something that seems to have an all-encompassing explanatory power, and I think the most prominent purveyor of this sort of thinking, a smart but I think in some ways misguided one, is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is the one of the leading proponents of this kind of white lash argument that figures white supremacy and whiteness as not only foundational but seemingly immutable and primordial, and that abstracts racism and race from political economic context. The recent popularity of these sorts of arguments reminds me of a line in your book that talks about a treatment of race that has it so that, having arisen historically, race then ceases to be a historical phenomenon and becomes instead an external motor of history.
Just when you said that, reminded me of a line, I think it is quoted in Racecraft, of my mentor, the great historian C. Van Woodward, who, in talking about white supremacy in the closing decades of the 19th century, said the question was never white supremacy. It was which whites will be supreme. And that's one of the things that this whiteness argument, it covered up then and it covers up now. Not all white people have the same power. Not all white people are in the same class position. And even if you can argue convincingly that they all have bigotry and prejudice, which is certainly not true across the board, but even if you do that, you have to acknowledge that not everyone has the same level of power and the same level of responsibility, and therefore not everybody figures the same way in any plans we might try to have to get out of this situation. We're living in the midst of the most unrelenting and successful period of class warfare, I think, in American history. And the targets are working people, all kinds of working people. And the more we allow ourselves to look away from the structural political reasons for it, the more we're just helping those who have their feet on our necks hold them there more solidly.
Why do you think that many on the liberal left find this analysis of Trump's rise that begins and ends with whiteness and racism? Obviously, Trump is a virulent racist, but this analysis of racism that lacks political, economic, historical context, why is that so attractive to so many?
It's a mystery to me, unless I consider how little historical knowledge or reading they have about how class societies operate in even our own, in the first place, and in our own past. It's attractive to think that, well, the thing that's front and center is our identities and how we learn to get along together, to have interracial, race relations that are good, that we can cooperate, but not the thing that's going on because they've never knew it was going on. And they didn't know what was going on when cotton was the product produced by slaves in the South and white people who didn't count in the North in the mills. You see, that didn't enter into the history that our generation now has inherited. And it's good to say that there's been some history recently that is bringing that very much into view.
And I think there's also been a period of such intense political demobilization that large numbers of people, certainly it's true of a lot of people the age of my students, but it's also true of the people who like to think of themselves as the opinion setters, the scribbling and babbling classes, the people who write for the general circulation dailies and so on. The long period of political demobilization has gotten them into a state where they really can't tell which end is up. My sister and I are old enough that we were at the 1963 March on Washington, which has now become almost a mythic event. And one thing that is indelibly part of our memory of that occasion is the way the crowds that assembled there. A lot of them were people wearing those curious little straw builder hats, but they would have on them the insignia of the UAW, that is United Auto Workers, for those in your audience who've never heard of that, and various other unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And the point I'm making, steel workers, yeah. The point, our mine workers, the point I'm making is that that march, its official designation was a march for jobs and freedom. It was part of political mobilization at that time, even in the recent aftermath of not in the aftermath, in the midst of the Cold War and the purges and so on, people still understood the connection between labor and civil rights and that kind of agitation. So the people were out there, and the honorary leader, and in fact the person whose idea it was, A. Philip Randolph, he was a labor organizer. He was a union activist as well as an activist in demanding rights for black people. Those connections were so natural that even dummies and political novices understood the connections. They've been gone for a long time. And the result is that, number one, when somebody says working class people or working class voters today, when someone in the press or the information media, misinformation media, it might as well be called, when they say working class voters, they invariably mean white people. They have forgotten that most Afro-Americans in this country are working people. Most Latinos, however you define that ambiguous term, most of them are working people. Southeast Asian migrants, most of them are working people, and indeed a good many East Asian migrants. We have allowed that language to become part of the whiteness talk. And the result is that when things happen, as they are happening hot and heavy today, that are targeted against working people, our reaction fragments us so that we can't even talk about it that way. It's this attack on people of color, or it's that attack on black people, or on immigrants, or dreamers, or whatever it is. We're not going to get anywhere that way, because we have defined any possible political alliance out of existence before we've even tried to build it. If Ta-Nehisi Coates, I like him a lot, by the way. I've only met him a couple of times. I like him a lot, and some of his work is deeply moving. But Ta-Nehisi Coates, if he were right about the situation, you'd have to say there's no exit. There's nothing we can do. It reminds me of what people used to say about the prospect of nuclear war back in the days when we had air raid drills, the illusion of shelters and so on. And somebody said, well, the only thing you can do about it is put your head between your legs and kiss your behind goodbye.
Duck and cover.
That seems to be the political prescription that comes out of the whiteness. I don't know if whiteness is the right term for it, but that comes out of the primordial white racism argument. There's nothing to do about it. Put your head between your legs and kiss your butt goodbye.
A corollary argument that people like Coates make is that attempts to talk about class are efforts to distract from racism or to exculpate the white working class for its bigotries.
It's a devastating bad mistake. It's just intolerable as a mistake. I'd like to come back to having said that the idea, the personalized, the identitarian understandings lead you in the wrong direction. And it leads many people in the wrong direction. And they tend to say, we're talking about that now. That's fundamental, not economics, not class. You bring class in, you're trying to deny the reality of human existence in an identity. But that is the big mystification that is achieved by Racecraft. It looks like what looks like a relation between people. Race relations is really an economic relation that's subverted, that's submerged. That's the American ideology. We have a polyhuman society, and we have an economic order that goes relentlessly in the same way as untouchable and untalkable, because people live in identities without understanding. They live in the world of work. Now, but the era that Barbara was talking about, the labor era, they were fighting fights to get rights. But now that's not here, and not even legitimate in the eyes of some people. Barbara, catch me if I've gone too far.
I'd like to ask some of the people who believe deeply in this framework of it all has to do with the white psyche, or I don't know where it's located. The psyche, the guts, the bowels, I don't know where it is, but the white something. I'd like to ask them, well, so what do you do about it? What do we do about it? Do we sit back and just allow the juggernaut to run over us? Or do we do something? And if we do something, what is it? Now, here's the other thing about the white primordialists, and that term used to be used back when Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black was the talk of at least the scholarly people discussing this. But there were others, and it all had to do with white racism. It goes practically back to the egg. You find it in the Bible and so on. And the thing about that argument always was, if this is something that is fundamental, that is built into white people, it has to be built into everybody. So it must be built into black people as well. Because if you don't believe that it's built into everybody, then you are back with the first premise of racism, which is that there's not one human species, there are many. We're all different.
I think that's a very important point, that the primordial account of white racism has as its necessary corollary biological race theory as well on some level.
Yes.
Well, it has to, or else they're left saying that this is something that's programmed into white people, but it's not programmed into anybody else. Well, how does it happen that it's not programmed into anybody else? Well, the only way that could arise is if they accept the really old and discredited notions of separate creation or distinct races and so on, because otherwise you have to assume that this whiteness thing is everybody's creation. And I've never been presented face to face with someone who was prepared to carry this argument through. But I would like to be, because I want to hear what they have to say about that. If white people have this, doesn't everybody have to have it? And if everybody has it, then how do you account for any of the moments in history when it's been possible to break free of some of it? When it's been possible to have cracks in the structure, when there have been alliances among people who are in the opposition, how do you account for that?
It also seems a big political problem with the primordialist account of racism also seems to be that the upshot for white people, self-interested white people, reading that account would be to act in defense of white supremacy. If racism is good for white people, won't that convince many to be racist? I think it's interesting that a lot of contemporary white supremacists and white nationalists refer to white people embracing racism as race realism. Another term that's in vogue with them is human biodiversity. So I think it's telling that these avowedly racist white supremacist people on the right seem very aware that race, believing in the primordial account of race, is a critical part of racism.
Yeah, as a catechism that includes the inherent distinctness of the different peoples corresponding to the names that human beings invented for them.
Yeah, I think that it really does not serve those of us on the left to believe that the tools of tribalism will ever be tools of liberation. They can't be. If it comes down to a battle of tribes, firepower will win every time.
Well, I have another dimension. I want to think if that runs through all this. You asked about our different educational and professional trajectories, and mine has gone via Max Weber, the great sociologist of the 19th century, turn of the 20th. He said it's fundamental in a collection called The Social Psychology of the World Religions. What's fundamental to religion is an explanation of misfortune, that a theodicy that explains why some people do well and some people don't. And there's a route to calm in a society if everybody shares that theodicy. And that's a religious thing he was talking about, but I think of race thought as religious in that sense. It is very definitely there as something to answer the question, why are we so blessed for the people who are doing well and who think they're the most beautiful creatures that were created, and and those who didn't do well, something was wrong with them. Let's find out what it was. Is it the skin color, which entails low intelligence and laziness, or what is it? You see, that becomes a language for explaining the facts that are, quote unquote, explaining the state of affairs, without doing so, but with a mystique that people then take on because they have the objects, they have the races that are daily constructed by the rituals that we go through that establish the inferiority of some people and the superiority of some people. And Barbara and I emphasized a lot those actions that go on because we're not talking about a thing. The set of ideas is a thing. We're talking about actions that both express and recreate those beliefs, those ideas. And so chapter 2 is about things you can see if you're walking down the street, if you're paying attention, that are rituals that establish bad fortune for some and good fortune for others, and the feeling of it if you're in it yourself. So if you're on the committee that designs the segregation law for Charleston, you know it's on your, you benefit from it psychologically, and you explain the situation of others to your satisfaction. And if they can control what those other people are taught, they'll teach themselves the same thing.
I think that's underlining an important point that I wanted to ask you about, which is how the practice of racism conjures up and recreates race again and again. We discussed the case of Amadou Diallo, who had the category of blackness imposed on him and was shot died in a hail of 41 bullets in 1999. Other things that come to mind as examples of how racism currently reproduces race are the huge numbers of black people in prison, and how that not only marks black people as criminal, but really produces blackness, and similar things with residential and school segregation, and how the black ghetto or the almost entirely black urban public school for many people, seem to be the result of the action of Black pathology rather than of racism.
The way it gets translated into the thought patterns of ordinary people, ordinarily informed Americans, which is to say pretty uninformed, because Americans as a group are uninformed. But that's a pretty accurate representation of how they form their notions. So they will read in the paper about the numbers of Black people in prison, and that helps to solidify their identification of Black people with criminality. And they don't have to have experienced it at all to know that it is a reality and that it is a characteristic of Black people. One of my colleagues in the Southern Historical Association had me in stitches one year talking about he was commenting on a remark that somebody had made about how he, or maybe it was a she, felt in seeing a Black person approaching on the street, and said, I just can't help remembering that, quoted some statistic, 3 out of every 4 Black people are in prison, something like that, whose purpose was to say, I have a reason for why I feel uneasy when I see this person approaching you on the street. And my colleagues said, well, if 3 out of 4 Black people are in prison, then they can't be approaching you on the street. Yeah, so you don't need to feel uneasy about that person. So, but that is it's a reductio ad absurdum. But that is the way people are inclined to form their notions about human beings that they know very little about, they have very little experience with, but they think they know a lot about. And it informs the experiences that they will then have in dealing with those people. Just before you called, I was out walking my dog and on an area that's controlled by the New York City Parks Department, and it's next to a playground where dogs are not allowed. And a white man, I have to characterize him this way because he soon proved that that's what he was, had left his dog tied up next to the playground where the dog didn't have any business, while he was at the far end playing with his daughter on the swing, and the dog was in a way standing post so that I couldn't even approach with my dog. And I approached the man and I said, "Is that your dog?" And he immediately went into attack mode. "Are you the park police? I'm just out here with my daughter, and I'm playing with my daughter, and there's a big park, and blah 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 blah." And I didn't say to him, I thought afterwards, this is what I should have said, instead of allowing him to heat the situation to simmering, if not boiling point right away. What I should have said to him was, one way to react in a situation like this is to say, "Oh, I'm sorry," knowing that you're legally in the wrong. "Oh, I'm sorry, is my dog in your way?" But instead, his reaction, he sees an elderly black woman approaching with her dog, and his reaction doesn't have anything to do with respect for the older person. It doesn't have anything to do with respect for the law. It's right away my entitlement. He's right away a white person facing down a black person. And he didn't say any of that. And I wish I had made him say it by starting with, "Why don't we start with courtesy? Why didn't you start by apologizing?" And then let it come out so that he could see it. But I was so angry I couldn't even do that. I'm a teacher, and I missed a moment when I could have taught him something, because there he is with his 2-year-old daughter. He told me that detail. And he's teaching her to be as big a so-and-so as he is.
It's the worst feeling to come up with the best comeback just a minute or two too late.
Yeah. Yeah. The French used to call it the spirit of the stairway. As you're walking down the stairs to leave the place where you should have made the statement, you think of what you should have said. But it's such a small moment, though, that really embodies all the moments like that. And it doesn't have to be only the racist moments either. But our society being what it is, it often takes the form of racist moments because the person who knows that he's put his dog in the wrong place and knows that he's violating the law, but confronted by a black person pointing this out, will go right to the ground where he is uppermost, and not think that this is an instance where courtesy and fellow feeling should take precedence, but they won't and they can't in the atmosphere that we have.
This reminds me of the discussion in the book of Du Bois and the notion of double consciousness. Mm-hmm. And something that was palpable for me reading the book was that it seemed to be motivated by both of your very understandable, I assume, lifelong frustrations over not being approached as Karen and Barbara Fields, but immediately interpolated as Black woman.
That's right. And that's one of the sources of the book itself. We have gone back and forth for years over the things that happen in the heights of academe of this sort. Barbara comes down the street and has somebody who who she tries to say hello to because they're in the same building where they have classrooms, and he jumps as if he's going to be attacked. He doesn't recognize that she's a colleague, and there are many stories like that. And there's no amount of time it seems that you can be around there without looking like you don't belong there. Places like that, and places like the university I worked in. That's why I kept a ethnographer's guide, since I'm a sociologist, and wrote a draft called Race Matters in the American Academy, and described things with using people's names, the things of that sort that happened, establishing status, superiority, these subtle and unsubtle ways of saying who's in charge. And I circulated it, open list, and I said, write back if any one of these is inaccurate. No one wrote a word. Yeah. No one said it was wrong. And I said, I gave examples like that, but others that were worse.
Our father was an architect, and who had a practice by the time later in his career. He was a sole practitioner, and most of a good bit of his work, let's say, was for the Roman Catholic Church. He did a lot of institutional things. But the thing about being an architect is that often your clients don't have to see you in person. So many of his clients were dealing with the firm, but they had no idea who the principal of the firm was. And he told us he told us this many times. He said, not a day goes by that somebody does not remind me that I'm Black. And one instance he gave was the client who, for some reason or other, had to come into the office, and the office was in one of those 3-story federal buildings in Washington, and his office was upstairs. So when he had to meet the client, he had to come down the stairs, and he described the face of this person as he saw a Black person coming down the steps and realized that was the Bob Fields that he had been talking to as an architect. And all of a sudden, Bob Fields materializes as a Black man, and he doesn't know what to do about it.
And his whole
go ahead.
His faith in the certainties of the universe came crashing down in that one instance.
Yeah, but you look at dozens of those situations and what they teach all the people who are participating in them about the way the world works. Now, I mentioned one of them in the article that subsequently appeared in Racecraft because it
the Huntington,
stood out for me.
I think it's Huntington, Pennsylvania.
No, I was coming to that one too. But this one is the little boy who was the son of one of the staff members in the department where I taught for semester at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. And the mother was, this is a white woman, but everybody there was really people. They were all decent people. And one day she was telling us that her son had come back from school or playground or someplace where he was with other kids his age, 4 or 5 or something like that. And he was talking about one of his playmates, and his mother asked him if the playmate was black. And the little boy said, "No, he's brown." And then the mother chuckled, and when she told the story to everybody else around there, we all chuckled, because for everyone, I think it was in the first place, it was a story about the innocence of childhood and about the fact that children don't know anything about races. They don't think anything about them. They don't come naturally to racism. So that was the first and heartwarming level of that story. But the next level of the story for me was reflecting on what that little boy learned when his mother chuckled when he said, "No, he's not black, he's brown." And what the little boy learned was that the answer I gave to that question is not the right answer. Grown-ups like it and they laugh at it, but the fact that they laugh at it tells me that it's not really the right answer. So the next time he's asked that question, he will know that to ask whether his playmate is black is not to ask for a description, it's to ask for a classification. And he will grow up knowing that.
And this is every American's miseducation and every American child's miseducation in racecraft.
Well, yes, it is, but look at what else it is. It's also in Oxford, Mississippi, at Ole Miss, which still lives in infamy. It is also an illustration of a white person who is happy because her child is growing up free of racism. And that's what stimulates the chuckle. That's what makes it funny to her. So here's a person whose faith is good, whose will is good, whose intentions are good, and she's reacting to a situation that could happen anywhere in the country, but her reaction to it is, "I'm so glad that my little boy isn't a racist." And while she was reacting that way, she was teaching him as a friend of mine, an email friend. I only know him from email correspondence. She's teaching him what that friend referred to as learning how to color. And children have to learn it. It's not programmed. We don't have it automatically, but somehow they learn how to color. And they can learn in innocent situations, even heartwarming situations. Or they learn in the situation you just referred to, the children at the playground, at the swimming pool. At a country club, Karen knows this story better than I do.
Yeah.
Where the children had been permitted to go by the director gave permission. But some of the members were not privy to it. And so there was a reaction of horror when all these black children show up. And one little girl who doesn't understand, these are children, she doesn't understand what all the fuss is about. So she asks if she's too dark to go swimming.
And the black children, and maybe also Hispanic, I'm not sure, come into this pool in suburban Philadelphia, and white parents are literally pulling their children from the water.
Yes, running as though something had come from the jungle or outer space.
And the children, from what I understood, it's not that the children were afraid. It's that their parents were instantly panic-stricken and had to drag the kids out. And Karen is the one who first came upon this episode. And the point she made about it, when you see it at first, you have an immediate reaction. Anybody of decency and goodwill has an immediate reaction about what's wrong with that. But the next reaction on reflection that Karen had was the news media are prepared to cover this from the standpoint of the black children and how they felt about it. And it was one of them who featured the little girl saying, "Am I too dark to go swimming?" But the point Karen made was, what did those white children make of that situation?
And they didn't try to find out.
They did not think it was a question.
Yeah.
It's a kind of incident that is educating those young white people to have the same sort of beliefs about race that their parents did in grabbing them out of the water.
Yeah,
exactly.
And
that
the
must
thing
be
is,
terrified.
Yeah, and the further point about that is that just as that little black child didn't know what all this was about, neither do the white children at first. And some of them will have reacted, no doubt, because children react this way when they see something that they think, that's not fair. That is one of the reactions that comes from young children out of their own play situations and their knowledge of the world. So some number of those white children probably reacted with distress to what happened. We don't know that.
And
we don't know what
by
they
their
asked.
parents why it was necessary, natural, and normal.
Yeah. We don't know what conversations happened after that or what questions the white children asked. So, and there you have it. And the people who make an overweening monster out of whiteness, it's something built into white people, they're not looking at the textural details of a situation like that. Because if they did, then they would have to focus on this as something that is historical and it's particular to situations.
And it's and it's contingent and thus defeatable.
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is anybody who had all of the great thinkers about human societies who have tried to tackle it, they start with the assumption, if we figure out how this thing came into being, then we can figure out how to put an end to it. That was Marx's approach in talking about capitalism and capital. C. Van Woodward, when he tried to get at the origins of segregation, for all the attacks that scholars have made on his work since then, his main point was, if I can figure out where this thing started, then I can figure out how it can stop. If we don't have a historical understanding of these things, then we are trapped in a kind of Groundhog Day. And the thing has to just keep going on and going on and going on, and we have no clue how it began, and therefore no clue about how we might bring it to an end. And that's the crime of this type of thinking.
You chose the term racecraft by way of analogizing it to witchcraft, which is compelling on a lot of different levels. But for listeners who are not familiar with witchcraft and with the anthropological study of it, can you lay out how witchcraft operates and why the analogy works?
Well, yes, there's a reason the analogy works that doesn't serve my purpose. This is Karen speaking. They think that it means dismissal, that has no intellectual worth because witchcraft isn't true. And so I have to be careful with that. I was working on African religions before I came to this project, and they're a kind of thing that happened in the area I was studying that were witchcraft removal, revivals. And it was a very active cleaning of evil out of countries. And anthropologists became interested in saying, how could people who otherwise seem so practical have ideas like this? And one very brilliant one, E. Evans Pritchard, said, we have it too. And he wrote that book, Witchcraft, Magic, and Oracles Among the Zandi, to show the rational processes used. And that's that the rational processes involved are part of what we're doing. For example, we usually believe in cause and effect. If you kick a ball, it's going to go down the way. We know cause and effect. But somebody says, if you touch this black person, you're going to get sick, and it's believed, then it means that there's a different process. Let's not assume they're dumb to begin with. Let's say there's a process. And one of the things that goes with systems of belief that don't require ordinary causality is precisely that. You have great freedom to invent social reality that everybody shares, because everybody shares it verbally and experientially. And so I found it useful to read about witchcraft because there was so much kinship. We have bright people, and we have things happening, and we have foiled predictions, and those don't die. You know, you can't get rid of the prediction that black people are stupid or violent. You just can't. And so you see things. And for me, it was a lens that allowed me to see better what existed in my own society.
I'm Naomi Klein. You're listening to The Dig, as well you should be, and you can support them on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice by Jesse Hagopian and Denisha Jones. Black Lives Matter at School succinctly generalizes lessons from successful challenges to institutional racism that have been won through the Black Lives Matter at School movement. This book will inspire many more educators and activists to join the Black Lives Matter at School movement at a moment when this anti-racist work in our schools could not be more urgent and critical to education justice. As Ibram X. Kendi says of the book, the educators, students, and community activists whose stories are documented here are fighting for a transformative vision of what public schools can be, and the grassroots efforts we will need to get there. Black Lives Matter at School is an essential resource for all those seeking to build an anti-racist school system. Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice by Jesse Hagopian and Denisha Jones. Out now from Haymarket Books. Maybe looking at one of Evans Pritchard's most well-known examples from that book, which I read as a young undergraduate anthropology major, might help elucidate the analogy further. If I remember correctly, there's a scene where some sort of building, maybe a granary, the roof falls down on someone's head and kills them, and immediately witchcraft is suspected. Can you lay out what happens?
He says, well, they go. It is an event that falls in the category of things that can happen as a result of witchcraft, and the methods Evans Pritchard describes are oracular methods or divinatory methods. You figure out which it is, whether it's witchcraft or something else, by doing that, and they're experts of doing that. And then you figure out who in the same way. And then there are ways of proof. You find a certain kind of thing in the body of somebody who's a relative who died, or the person who's suspected of witchcraft, and so on. Those are the things that rationality can achieve in the service of things that on the surface are not rational, because witchcraft is not possible. It's amazing. The center problem of witchcraft, witchcraft is what I was saying a while ago, the theodicy problem. Again, why do bad things happen to good people? And there's a set of answers, and they all have to be in the metaphysical realm or the imaginative realm, but not like science. And they're not for that stupid. They're just a way of thinking that is human to the core.
Independently, we found ourselves, because we exchange things that we've written periodically, and independently we found that we were both comparing race, the way it works in American society, with witchcraft. And I did it in an article in which I was arguing against the primordialists who think that there's nothing to explain historically because there's something that's always been there in white people. But we both ended up with an analogy with witchcraft. And I think in both our instances, the necessary first step was that we had to have some kind of intellectual detachment from American society and the American version of race, thinking about race. It can be an actual physical detachment, but you have to have a way of taking a distance from it. In another article, I said that otherwise you are trying to lift something up while you're standing on it. You can't lift it until you step off. And the stepping off is taking a distance from the way people think about race in American society. And for me, one of the most dramatic ways that happened was when I spent a year in Tanzania, which Karen, by the way, had done before I did. But I learned to speak Swahili. And one of the many things that stood out for me about that was learning that in Swahili, the words for black and white were never used to distinguish people of African descent from people of European descent. Yep. If they used mweupe and mweusi, which are black and white in Swahili, they were using them the same way we might speak of someone as blonde or brunette, as light complexioned or dark complexioned, but it also is just a color, like the little boy. Is he black? No, he's brown. It was a color distinction. And when they were actually trying to distinguish white from black the way Americans might do it, they had words that refer to national origin. So an African was a Mwafrika, a person of European extraction was Mzungu, which could also be an American. And one particular episode that crystallized things for me was an Afro-American woman who had married a Tanzanian, and she had lived in Tanzania for a long time. She was fluent in Swahili, and she thought of herself as an African person. Now, she stood out on the streets of Dar es Salaam because she always dressed in elaborate West African bubas and lace headpieces and all the rest of the costume that an ordinary working Tanzanian couldn't possibly afford. So while she was identifying herself as African in this way, she was setting herself apart. But she didn't realize this. And one day I encountered her almost in tears. Well, she was in tears because a Tanzanian had referred to her as a Mzungu, which means a European, a white person. And she, how can you call me Mzungu? I am Mwafrika. How can you say that? Well, they could say that because she had the money, she had the bearing, she had all of the appurtenances of the people who would be called Mzungu. And so that meant that this whole way of talking about people's origins or their belonging or the way they looked just was incommensurable with the way we do it in the United States. And I needed to experience that in order to be able to write about race when I came back home and went to graduate school, because that was being in a place where I was surrounded by black people, but not black people. You see, they were Wa Tanzania, or they were Wa Africa. There was a Ghanaian woman in the circle in which I often moved in Dar es Salaam, who actually was criticized by some of the local people because she couldn't speak Swahili and they didn't believe it. Well, how can she not speak Swahili? So they thought she was just being a snob. So I had a whole system of classification to understand that was engaged in by people who would be, by Americans, they would be classified as black people. And that took race, that turned race into a historical phenomenon for me, so that when I wrote about it later, I couldn't write about it the way the primordialists did. It just...
The story you tell about this woman, Dar es Salaam, is in some ways the inverse of Amadou Diallo's story and of these sort of racial classification systems being lost in translation. In Diallo's case, obviously, it was a tragic and horrific, and in this woman's case in Dar es Salaam, farcical. But they seem to both point towards similar lessons.
Yeah, and one thing, I didn't say this when we were talking about Diallo, but one of the things that I have long thought about that situation is that if the police officers had realized that he was African, they wouldn't have shot him. They, in other words, they make a distinction between black people, which is Afro-Americans, and Africans and others, but it's just that it's not visible. You can't, they may think you can see, but you can't see. So I think that had they had an inkling when they approached that apartment building that they were dealing with an African immigrant, they would not have reacted the way they did.
They would have been more likely to think he was reaching for his wallet as he was. Yeah,
or they might have not have assumed that he was an armed rapist in the first place. You know, he was reacting. This is my assumption about it. He was reacting to what looked like armed thugs who came into the place shouting, and he thought he could buy them off by giving them his wallet. Nobody, no white police officer would ever assume that a black person, which is the way they saw him, could react to a white person as to a street thug. You know, it didn't occur to them. They dressed as street thugs because that was their undercover outfit, but it never occurred to them that they could actually read to a civilian on the street as street thugs, because to them, street thug means black person. So it doesn't even occur to them, and it didn't even occur to the news media at the time, that he thought he was about to become the victim of a street crime. And they couldn't see it that way. But I think that if they had recognized him as an African, maybe they wouldn't have believed that even an African could see a white police officer as a thug, but I think they would not have seen him immediately as a threat that needed to be taken down with gunfire.
I think an important point in your book, you were both talking about this critical distance necessary to see racecraft for what it is, that you can't pick something up while you're standing on it, I think is the way you phrased it.
Yeah.
And what you identify racecraft as is ideology, which is a word that I think you use in its Marxist sense rather than what it might mean in its various colloquial uses. Can you define the term ideology in the sense that you're using it and explain how racecraft operates as an ideology?
I can't quote from the German ideology, or for that place in the book on chapter 4 of chapter 1, section 4 of Capital, Fetishism of the Commodity and the Secret Thereof. But first thing I would say is read that, and you will see the man coming to grips with the transformation of an ordinary object into something else through the social process of trade. So the objects of trade, he goes on in that section in a hilarious way, saying the articles, according to the ideology, speak of them as have them speaking to each other, rather than passing each other as communication from the source of the sender and the returner there. And it's a clouding of reality that you cannot see in the day-to-day process of whatever it is, because it's not there to explain itself. It's there to operate on understandings of how it works that are in a place or trading would not be possible.
Yeah, and so when I talk to my students about this, I turn it into a laughing matter in a way, because I say, isn't it amusing that we speak of the economy, and all of you've heard we talk about the economy. It's a human being. It can be depressed, just as a human being can be depressed, but there is no such thing as the economy. It is actually the result of many millions of individual decisions that people make. And we speak of it as the economy, personified or reified, better, precisely because we can't get hold of all those individual actions, but we have to simplify it for our minds. So we turn it into the economy. And then I explain to them, this isn't original with me, that if you have a village where the elders will say to different families, all right, you grow this much grain, you grow that much grain, and you plant this field, and you deal with that field. And then at harvest time, the elders say, all right, you get this much of the harvest because you have this size family. You get that much of the harvest because you have another size. And as a result, all of the product of all of their work has been distributed among everybody. And then I tell the students, nobody in that society who was not a lunatic would say that these decisions are the product of the economy, because they would all see that these are the decisions that the elders made. They would know exactly where it came from. We reify those decisions when we can't actually see where they came from. So we talk about them in that way. Well, that is the way ideologies develop, because ideologies are ways of talking about the world as we experience it. And sometimes we're experiencing here's the actual process. This elder said, do this and do that. But sometimes we are seeing through a glass darkly, as St. Paul puts it. We cannot see what's actually going on, but we give a name to the result of what's going on. And then we account for it in whatever rough and ready way we may have. That is my understanding of an ideology. It's not a scientific explanation. It's a rough and ready approximation. This is why we do that. When you get to, and this is an example that I have in the article and I use it with my students often, when you come up to a red light, you don't sit and ruminate on the philosophy of what you do at an intersection that is controlled by a red light. I used this example once talking to an audience in Brazil, and they laughed at me, though, because I was talking about a society where you actually stop for a red light, and they were laughing at me. They said, nobody here stops for it. But the point is, we do have a reason why we stop for the red light. And there's an explanation that actually makes a lot of sense, but it's not a calculation that we make at the corner. The explanation is everybody understands that regardless of our respect for the law or not, we need to know what everybody else is going to do at the intersection. And we have lights there or stop signs or some other convention, if there's nothing material like that, so that everybody knows what everybody else will do at the intersection. And when you are a teenager and your parents are teaching you how to drive, they will tell you what you're supposed to do at a four-way or at a red light or at a flashing yellow and so on. Well, that's the approximation of an ideology. It's what you need to know to get through the intersection or to get through the day. It is not.
And it need not be demonstrable by thought process outside the context in which that's being done.
Yeah, and it may not, and it need not be aware of Who designed the first traffic light? Where was the first traffic light? How did people react? You know, you don't have to know all that. You have a habit of doing a certain thing when you come to that light, and you have an explanation that's good enough for why you need to do it. And I tell my students that it not only is it not scientific, but it better not be too detailed in how it gets to grips with the underlying reality, because otherwise it puts you in the position of the mythical millipede who was asked, how in the world can you walk with all those legs? And as soon as he stopped to think about it, he couldn't walk anymore. Ideologies are what allow us to walk with 1,000 legs and not think about it, because if we think about it, then we can't do it.
And so, with regard to racecraft as an ideology, would you agree with Stuart Hall's formulation that race is the modality in which classes lived, class relations experienced and fought out?
It can be. And I think in this country, that's as good a statement as any, because when people weren't a race by virtue of being Africans in European society, but they became that after they arrived. And in the United States, because they were incorporated into a society where people could take freedom for granted. In other words, it was not a society premised on the normality of slavery. Slavery was normal and became even more normal in part of the country, but in the country as a whole, it had been present from the very beginning. All the 13 original colonies had slavery at the time of the Declaration of Independence. But shortly thereafter, most of them either abolished it or they began the process of abolishing it. So enslavement became a sufficiently anomalous situation that it had to be accounted for. But ideologically, I mean, this isn't science, although it could be couched as science in this era when people were starting to speak that way. But it's really ideological. And it's that there's something different about people of African descent that defines this anomalous situation they occupy in a country where freedom is to be taken for granted. Well, my argument is that the next step, emancipation, deposits the former slaves for the most part into another social category that's not accepted as a basis for citizenship, because now they're proletarians, they're working people. And there were white people in that status, but it still was not accepted. The idea was still one day you're going to have property and you're going to have power. Abraham Lincoln said there's no such thing as a hireling laborer having to be a hireling laborer all his life. It wasn't yet accepted that being dependent on working for somebody else could be the status of a citizen. But most of the black slaves were released into just such a category. So their class position is the way they are defined as a race. It was when they were slaves, because slave was an anomalous category, and working people, proletarianized working people, is their categorization as free people. I'm talking about the former slaves. So both of those are class positions that come to define a racial position. So if that's the point Stuart Hall was making, then I think he had an insight that's correct to the American situation.
Today, how do race and racism continue to reproduce and justify the political economic order?
Let me just say, and let me recommend listeners to the work of Adolph Reed, because He's a political scientist and one of the people who most clearly, and there are a number of younger people doing this too. Cedric Robinson comes to mind. In spite of what a good many of the race first, last, and all the time people say, a number of Afro-Americans are part of the bourgeoisie, not the black bourgeoisie, which was what I think when Franklin Frazier used that term, he was using it sarcastically in a way.
Yep.
To talk about people who were precisely not a bourgeoisie, a petty bourgeoisie perhaps. We have a lot of Afro-Americans, not a lot statistically, but there are a number of Afro-Americans who are in fact incorporated into the bourgeoisie. But most are working people, and at the hazard of whatever happens to working people. But there are working people who, in the parlance of American journalism, American public discourse, don't get to be working people because that category is reserved for white people. So we have a whole working class, a whole part of the American working class that the scribbling and babbling classes don't understand to be part of the working class.
That brings up an issue that you both said you really didn't want to, I think both of you said you really didn't want to discuss, and you can shoot it down. But I really do think that your analysis would provide some interesting insight into why Rachel Dolezal identifying as black but quote unquote actually being white, why this odd transgression so infuriated people on the left and so delighted people on the right.
Well, I wasn't aware of people on the left or on anything I would call the left being infuriated by it. But my reaction was, why would someone need to put up a pretense? The history of agitation on behalf of the rights of black people has never depended on your identifying yourself as a black person. The NAACP had white leaders before it had a black leader.
And its first black leader was a white man. Remember? Well, we were talking about him just now, but if I may break in, he opens, "I am a Negro. My skin is white, my hair is blonde, my eyes are blue. I am a Negro." And that he was the first black, or rather, Negro head of the NAACP. Walter White.
Yeah, A Man Called White was the name of his book. And
he called it, yes.
And he part of his effectiveness was that he could go and investigate lynchings in the South because he could mingle without people knowing that he was a Negro. He actually recounts an episode, I think it was on a train, but my memory may be playing tricks, in which he heard a group of white people talking right in front of him about what they were going to do if they ever could lay their hands on this Walter White character, this Negro from the NAACP, and they didn't know that he was right there. I don't know how we got off onto him.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess in Dolezal's case, I'm wondering just why people were so upset at the sort of unusual situation of a white woman passing as black and being exposed. Why it became so, why this sort of oddity that turned the historical kind of pattern on its head was so troubling to people.
Well, I said all that to say that it didn't trouble me, except that I thought here's another oddity that people are, it's another rope-a-dope. We're going to focus on this one. There are more important things going on, and who cares? I couldn't understand why she would need to pose as anything, because she could be a leader of the NAACP as a white woman. You know, it doesn't matter. So, and I don't understand why anybody would have been upset by any of it, except to the extent that it was a stupid conversation, a stupid episode that was treated as though it were something of major importance. And that's why I said, you said we shot it down. Yeah, we're tired of people talking about racial identities as though that's the issue. It's not the issue. And whether somebody calls herself white or black isn't really something that we need to be focused on, but you can understand why the news media like that, for the same reason they like stories about a white woman who gives birth to twins and one of them is dark-skinned and the other is white. And then they turn it into a whole episode. And I know they're going to just go nuts. They've already started with the woman who's planning to marry the Duke or the Prince of whatever it is in Britain.
For many, it does pass as an issue of justice. I as absurd as that sounds, that Rachel Dolezal saying she's black is people would use this language, I'm not making it up, that it's doing some sort of violence to black people.
Yeah, I know. Well,
their identity.
The category I would put it in would also include the people who get angry because a white woman wore her hair in cornrows, or who got angry at the novelist who, in a deliberate protest against the charge of cultural appropriation, she gave a talk wearing a sombrero. And I thought she was making valid points. I didn't really understand the point of the sombrero, but I think it must be part of the same phenomenon. And I don't understand why people get angry because somebody did a photograph or did an impression of a photograph of Emmett Till. Emmett Till. Yeah, but I think it's the same thing, the same kind of anger that you're talking about. And I call it adolescent behavior by people who can't think of anything more important to do.
I mean, but I think that's precisely it. It's a way of talking about certain things so as to not intentionally,
not talk about the real thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another part of your argument. I personally think that it is analytically important to identify the way that racism has different within capitalism has disparate impacts on different groups of people. But I think you make a very important point about the exclusive focus in some quarters on racial disparity, because by implication it proposes that once the ruling class, working class, and poor are demographically representative, that everything will be great, or as you two write, that there are people whose most radical goal is the reallocation of unemployment, poverty, and injustice rather than their abolition. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the focus on racial disparity, and for someone like me who does believe that it needs to play some role in analysis, what role, if any, you think it should play in a left-wing critique of the ruling political economic order?
Everybody needs to be able to know that exists as a fact, well documented. But that fact won't carry a lot of water elsewhere. But it does matter if you're talking in the air, hand waving, rather than saying this and this and this exists, when you're making a claim to an action to affect the North Carolina's allocation of funds toward the support of agriculture, for example, when they lost out as they did on exports. But it is important to be able to speak of facts. But speaking of facts is not a politics or a guide to policy. You have to use the facts.
You have to have a plan. Happening. Yeah, you have to know what you're going to do with it. We know that agricultural workers working in for the big growers, as the California people call themselves, they're not farmers, they're growers. We know that the people who work in those fields are subjected to pesticides as well as to all kinds of substandard, and I said California, but I could have been talking about other parts of the country too, substandard conditions. But if you turn that into an issue having to do with the identities of people of color, then you have let the agribusiness farmers off the hook.
Yes.
And we know why they take advantage of the workforce that has to do that has to approach closest to the pesticides, and it has to work without proper sanitary conditions sometimes, and so on. We know why they're doing that, and it's not because they have anything in their hearts about so-called people of color. It's because they're getting their work done in the cheapest way they can get it done, and they're happy to do that, and they don't really care about which people they're exploiting to do that. C. Van Woodward has a moment in his classic Origins of the New South where he's talking about the publicity about poor white people in the South and how they were often marketed to would-be investors from outside because they're not amenable to unionization and they'll accept low wages and so on. And part of the prospectus that they were selling to the outside people is, here is a group of people, they're out of history and out of time with an Elizabethan flavor. And Woodward really made fun of that. But he said that when people are selling the workforce that way, they really didn't distinguish that much the color of their wares, because the people who are buying don't care. They care what they're going to pay people. And this is the asymmetry of it, that the people who are the engine of this kind of exploitation, whatever they may say, they have their eyes on the prize. But we, who think we're trying to dismantle this, take our eyes off the prize all the time, and we allow ourselves to be rope-a-doped. We allow ourselves to get carried off in conversations about racial identities this and racial disparities that. When you mentioned racial disparities, by the way, I just thought of one of Adolph Reed's articles where he quotes an item that appeared in The Onion that it just said, these people are the most likely. Didn't have a predicate, just most likely. It was a comment on the disparity arguments, and it was in that context that Adolph Reed wrote about it. But I do think of it as a kind of rope-a-dope strategy, because you get people focused on something that's not really the essential. Yeah, and then you let the so-and-sos, I'm trying to use parliamentary language, you let the so-and-sos off the hook.
One example you use in your book about how Racecraft makes people unable to, that basically racism not only legitimates a class project but also obscures it, and obscures people's ability to see that the class project that's underway. You point to the reception of Richard Herrnstein's and Charles Murray's infamous book, The Bell Curve. They're neo-eugenicists, no doubt. They're racists, no doubt. You write that the focus, though, on their racism at the exclusion of all else obscured the fact that they were making that their overall argument was really about the degeneracy of poor people as a whole. And that was missed by mainstream critics.
Yeah, they were justifying class inequality. And we just recently had another go-around here at Columbia because Murray had been invited to speak. And I think most of the students who wanted to agitate, good-hearted students who wanted to agitate against it, and the faculty supporting them, I doubt that very many of them had read the book. And certainly they had no clue about the class dimension of it, because all they knew was that they had heard forever, he's a racist.
That's how they marketed the book at Free Press, I believe it was.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Systematically,
that's the photogenic part of the argument. The part of the argument that's not photogenic is the part that says that working class white people are where they are because they're not very smart, and they're backward.
And that was the entire focus of Charles Murray's, I don't know if it's his latest book, but a more recent book, I think it's called Coming Apart.
Yes.
Is basically looking at these
I've been reading that, yes.
Degenerate white working class people of Philadelphia.
When the well-meaning progressives around here wanted to agitate against it, that wasn't what they picked up. So here they are in what they think of as a Trump moment, and with a perfect opportunity to draw attention to a very explicit class project. And they let it slip because calling him a racist and talking about what he says about black people is more, it's going to generate more favorable publicity from their standpoint. It's going to certainly get the choir on its feet. And they're not talking to anybody else.
Their race project is one that someone like Hillary Clinton could condemn, but their class project is one that she wouldn't and couldn't.
Yeah, she's all for it. I mean, that's what the Democratic Leadership Council was all about. And, and in a sense, that's what Obama was all about. So that's why the bankers who came as close as possible to destroying this economy were bailed out and were not held to account for what they had done. That wasn't part of the program. And you can't really wonder why it is that the people who suffered in all that, who bought the subprime mortgages, and I'm talking about the white people, not just the black people, why they were sour that at the end of the day, they find we're here holding the can, and the people who did this have not been held to account. And where do we go for... Yeah, and where do we go for somebody who understands our situation? Well, you don't go to Hillary Clinton.
And there was this persistent critique in certain quarters of the Hillary-friendly liberal media, though, that Bernie's emphasis on class politics necessarily meant that he wasn't paying enough attention to racial justice.
Yeah, I heard that, and
such a liar, such a liar.
I used to listen to that with pictures. I have to confess, I don't have a television, but I do see a lot of the television images online nevertheless. And I have to say that I heard those criticisms, and then I would see the films of Sanders' rally, and there was always a healthy, well, I won't say always, but there was often a healthy representation of the Black Lives Matter people there. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the younger black people, and they may have been ardent Black Lives Matter enthusiasts, but they could see through Hillary Clinton. Well,
the polls make it very clear that young people of all sorts backed Bernie over Clinton.
Yeah.
But it reminds me, though, I did want to ask you, one thing that I wondered reading your book is what role racial identification can have for black people fighting for freedom who've had these racial categories imposed on them. If blackness is a category imposed upon black people by racecraft and by racism, is it possible for people to have a collective racial we in the fight against racism without falling into that trap of essentializing race? And I'm thinking particularly of this at this time when so many young black people are mobilizing under the banner of Black Lives Matter, which has that racial category right in its first word.
I'm not sure it's a racial category, although it certainly is a category that draws attention to racism. And that confusion of race and racism is one of the things we try to highlight in Racecraft. Over the years, Americans of African descent have had numerous ways of referring to themselves as a people, because they have been a people, and they've been made a people by the conditions that they have faced, whether those conditions were slavery, were Jim Crow, were segregation, were disfranchisement, job discrimination, segregation across the board in the military, housing, and whatever it was. They faced common circumstances that made them see themselves, recognize themselves as a people. But every time they designated themselves as a people, that became a racial designation. Didn't matter. There were arguments. We make this point in Racecraft. When colored as a term was replaced by Negro, and Negro was replaced by black, and every one of those was a way of defining a people, and every one of them, when it gets into the general vocabulary, is a racial designation. And that is part of my answer to your question, because when Black Lives Matter activists say Black Lives Matter, they're not making a racial statement. Couching it that way, I have to say this, though. I'm an older person, and I have to say that the slogan Black Lives Matter disturbed me mainly because it seemed to me too self-effacing. Having to declare that Black Lives Matter and making it official that that's something that needs to be declared is making too large a concession to the enemy. It reminded me, I was talking to Karen about this earlier today, it reminded me of perhaps the most famous of Frederick Douglass's orations, his 4th of July address that he delivered, I believe, in Rochester. In the mid-1850s. And the way he began was, I don't really know what you have brought me here to say, because he was asked to speak by abolitionists. I don't know what you want me to say. You don't need me. We're celebrating the anniversary of the birth of a republic, so you don't need me to tell you that slavery is wrong. I don't have to say that to Republicans. And you don't need me to tell you that the slaves are human beings, because even the slave owners know that, or they wouldn't have so many provisions in their legal codes that define acts committed by slaves as crimes. A mule can't commit a crime. A wagon can't commit a crime. So by defining acts by slaves as crimes, they're already saying. So he made a whole. If you haven't read it lately, read it again. He built the whole rhetorical structure on the argument. I don't need to tell you people these things because you know them. You're Republicans and you're abolitionists, so you know all these things. And I think about that when I think about young people having to say Black Lives Matter. Do Americans have to say that other Americans, and for that matter, other human beings' lives matter? Isn't that where we're supposed to start? Not what we're out to achieve. That should be, we know it hasn't been achieved, but isn't it our assumption about where we start? And to have to say Black Lives Matter and then open yourself up to an enemy to try to trump that with an All Lives Matter, when in fact the slogan Black Lives Matter always meant All Lives Matter. It was a way of saying, yes, ours too. But I don't like that they had to say ours too, as though there could be a question about whether ours matter, because everybody's matters.
It seems like the two of you would maybe prefer freedom now or something of that sort.
For all.
Yes. Yeah, although I don't think either of us is criticizing the young people who did that, because they responded to a moment, and they responded to a moment in which much of this history has been lost, including freedom now, but including Frederick Douglass and so on. So they're having to build the world anew. And it is some kind of commentary on us that we require our young people to build the world anew from scratch, that they don't have something to build on. And that's because of a long demobilization, a purging, a persecution, and so on, that left us and them without a political heritage on which to build. So everybody has to start again from the beginning. And, each time we do that, we have lost momentum and we've lost ground. And there may not be any alternative to doing it. You can't fabricate a historical knowledge that isn't there. But having to operate without that historical knowledge means that you're operating with one hand tied behind your back. So I'm delighted that we're having an opportunity to remind people that in 1963, the slogan was jobs and freedom. And in other words, everybody understood how one thing was related to the others. And now I'm not sure people do, because I'm not including myself, but I am charitably saying we believe in this whiteness metaphysics. And even the most conservative of the civil rights leadership of the 50s and 60s would be shaking their heads at that and thinking of us as benighted children who didn't know that much.
Well, perhaps we should prepare some radio casts of those speeches, to do that heritage out in a broad audience, in order to enrich the arguments people are trying to make as they attempt to resist and formulate what resistance should be made up of.
Yeah, by the way, this
is
going back a paragraph, but I meant to point this out and I didn't. Talking about Black Lives Matter, I was reminding Karen earlier this morning that when that young white man, whose name I now can't remember, was shot in South Carolina. Remember that? I think his first name was Jason.
The marijuana bust where he drove away, tried to drive away, and they just shot him to death.
But the point is, Seneca, South Carolina, I think, but certainly it was in South Carolina, a young white man, and he was killed by the police. And I was reminding Karen earlier today that the only way that episode was publicized was that some of the Black Lives Matter people publicized it. They put it on Twitter, and then it was picked up by some of the news media who follow such things. But that was how it came to public knowledge. So, and I'm saying that in order to illustrate that Black Lives Matter always meant all lives matter. It's just that the young people who were saying that thought that others needed to be told our lives too. But they did not forget that all lives matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't get very far because, as it happens, the white neighbors of the family whose son was killed didn't stand up for the family. I think they couldn't figure out where was a safe place to put their feet in what looked like quicksand because they probably assumed that these confrontations with the police are always confrontations in which the police are the good guys and whoever's on the other side is the bad guy. And Racecraft would allow them to make that assumption comfortably when the person on the other side was black. But now here's a white person that they know, small town, South Carolina, and they can't bring themselves to call this what it is because it's out of the pattern, and they don't have a way to understand that. If all lives matter were a serious declaration rather than a way of just twitting Black Lives Matter people, then the All Lives Matter people would have jumped on that, but they didn't, did they? They couldn't see it either. Because in fact,
how could they make sense of this white young man being treated like what they thought was what black young men deserved?
Exactly. And so they don't mean it when they say all lives matter.
Yeah, well, this is the function of the stuff I was talking about earlier. He must have done something to deserve this. That's the thing. And it's not his black color, but it's something. But that always rests on the Negro-like. Whatever he did must have been Negro-like to have that consequence. But I'd love to walk through and question people and ask them why they think this all happened. Their own opinion.
The way that racism functions to legitimate policies that harm working class people as a whole by sort of spectacularly harming black people and often Hispanic people more. So you have mass incarceration, which justifies itself by disproportionately locking up so many black people, but also locks up an extraordinary number of white people. The same with welfare reform, because welfare was disproportionately received by black mothers. That allowed the Clinton administration and congressional Republicans to eliminate welfare for all mothers.
Yeah. Well, and you can go back further. You can go back further to disfranchisement in the South in the late 19th, early 20th century, which was supposed to be the disfranchisement of Afro-Americans, but in fact it ended up disfranchising large numbers of white people, and was the beginning of the low voter turnout that continues to be part of American political society to this day. And the difference, though, between that time and our moment today is that the white people who became the targets were not fooled by it. They knew what was going on. Today, Today it may be that people aren't aware. It can be successfully hidden that this weapon that appears to be wielded against black people is being wielded against you as well.
That's sort of like the bad news side of that equation. But in your book, you write that the debacle of the bankers, talking about the financial crisis, rubbed the gloss from the justifications for inequality that prevailed since the 1980s. The welfare mother can no longer stand for what is not right with America. And so my question is, in terms of all these horrible things that have happened have been justified via racism, and obviously with Trump in office, racism is very much still a real core part of elite class warfare in this country. But since 2008, since the crisis shook, and since we've seen Occupy, the Bernie Sanders campaign, Black Lives Matter, do you see some hope in people getting that critical distance from Racecraft that you've been talking about, and being able to take collective action against this system that's done so much harm in this country and all over the world?
Well, we had in mind putting some ammunition in the hands of people who are trying to fight the most recent wave of capitalist oppression here, because we had recognized how useful the race card had been, and especially because we could see the ramping up of obsolete racial ideas in the 1980s, such as the races have different blood, and the Red Cross is putting that around. So we said one of the things to do is to get this information we have out and find other ways to get it out, because we need to be able to hear each other as Americans, and not this nonsense, about racial identities today. I say excuse me, because that's my opinion. I have it strongly. I don't want to impress anybody who thinks that it's very good to have a high self-esteem in this society, too. but it's just that it's a barrier that Racecraft provides an explanation for what happens bad to black people, and it's what do you call it? Barbara, that rope-a-dope for people who might otherwise be able to put their fist into the people who are exploiting their jobs abroad. So
yeah, but I think part of the present moment too is that we're seeing a program, even if it has been slowed down, a program on the part of the right-wing Republicans and the Trump people, who aren't always, I mean, they're an ox team not always pulling in the same direction, but they have a good
That's a generous description.
Yeah, they do have in common a class program, even if they sometimes are representing different parts of the class that is on top. And what we need to keep our eyes on is that in many ways they're building momentum because they are changing the nature of the game. They don't expect, for example, to have to pay for what they're going to do to a good number of white working people, as well as every other kind of working people, if they get this program through, because simultaneously they're working on what I call curating the electorate. They're working on ways to prevent people from voting or to prevent people's votes from counting. And because billionaires, I mean, it's easier to buy a state legislature than to buy the U.S. Congress, but these people can afford to do both. And so they are establishing a kind of momentum that is quite frightening, by which they hope to insulate themselves from being punished by the people they injure. They may not imagine that there's much that black people can do about it.
They expect that black people will be punished for what they have, for their injury. You know, the blame will be shifted into stories about welfare again. The welfare mother stories came back in when this process began in the 80s.
Yeah, but I think as is true of many classes with overweening projects of power, they don't really see their opponents clearly. And so they may not always be aware of what they're unleashing. And this frightens me as much as anything, because while they're confident that they can handle anything that's going to occur because of the racism, the homophobia, all the other ways that they provide fuel for anybody who wants to blow up the social structure. And they're pretty sure that they can insulate themselves from that. But I don't think they really envision what it will be if they truly unleash a white population that is both angry and hopeless. If they imagine that it will all be directed against scapegoats, maybe that's because they don't know what happens when all the holds are barred. I mean, when no holds are barred and all limits are off. So I'm not sure they really understand the fire that they're playing with.
And where are the openings and challenges for the left in this moment of incredible flux and uncertainty?
Well, I don't know if it's an opening, because I think too many people, well, maybe I shouldn't say the left, because maybe I'm talking about people who may call themselves the left, but they really aren't. But I think they're too progressives. That's the terminology they often use. Too many of them are not thinking about these things in class terms. And so what opening is there for them if their only answer to a general souring of working people with good reason, if their only answer is to say, well, so-and-so and so-and-so, black people and racism, so-and-so and so-and-so, Hispanics, so-and-so and so-and-so, gay marriage, so-and-so and so-and-so, you know, they have a map with all the different pieces. And it almost seems as though they're not aware that their map comes from an era that the enemy has superseded. It's just not working the same way. I watch the Democrats in Congress, and there's something almost laughable about watching Nancy Pelosi and Charles Schumer and all that group when they lumber into action with something that sounds, to use an expression our parents used to use, a day late and a dollar short.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, in other words, an opening depends on somebody capable of spotting it and capable of exploiting it.
That
it
was
depends
Bernie
in short on
Sanders,
an
so they all got
organization.
scared. Huh? Don't you think?
Yeah. Well, yes, in a way, but then I think sometimes the Bernie Sanders people are also the progressives who are sensitive to the. Well, you didn't talk enough about what was specific to black people or what was.
Yeah, this is.
And then they feel defensive about it, and then they think, well, maybe we ought to do a little of that. It's deadly. To me, what most stood out about the Sanders phenomenon was that Sanders actually found a way to talk about the overall inequality and injustice without trying to speak to individually designated portions of the population as though they were separate entities. And I don't want to lose that. That was a grace that this country was offered without deserving it. And in a sense, it was thrown away, and the Democrats, I blame mainly for it, because they decided that they would rather keep their apparatus and the apparatchiks who benefit by it, because they were threatened by someone who was actually able to leapfrog their...
And incorruptible.
Yeah, and so they helped to throw away a grace that we were given, and what we got instead is Donald Trump and his people. But his people, and I don't mean just literally his people around him, but the billionaires who've come into their own, they have a way of multiplying their power so that it keeps going up exponentially, and that's what, after a certain point, that's what having that level of money, that level of control over the apparatus is going to do. It goes back to something Thomas Jefferson warned about when he was talking about the Constitution of the state of Virginia and the need to guard against corruption and not allow overweening power anywhere. And he said the trouble with allowing this thing to get out of hand, he said we need to nip it in the bud before we have so many people holding so much power that we can't anymore. And he said the trouble is that the objects of this kind of power are also the engines of it. With men, we will get money. With money, we will get men. Everything turns around in an expanding circle, so that it gets bigger as it goes along. It feeds on what it is seeking. And I know that people will poo-poo Thomas Jefferson when I talk to my students about him. They're going to be remembering only, yeah, he was a slaveholder. Yeah, he did all he could to keep the Haitian Revolution influence from spreading, and all of those things. But he also, and his fellow slaveholder, James Madison, understood something about how power works. And while we are dismissing the other things that they bequeathed us, we need to remember a few of those that we have forgotten. And I remember thinking when Ronald Reagan was elected, I was at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and I ran into Henry Fairley, who was for my mind, big mouth conservative Brit who came over, worked wrote for the Washington Post, and here he is telling Americans how we ought to organize our societies. So he got on my nerves, but I ran into him at the Wilson Center shortly after Reagan was elected, and I said to him, well, at this moment, there's only one politician I have any faith in, and that's James Madison, because I hope he made this machinery sufficiently unworkable that these guys can't really do what they want to do. Well, apparently it wasn't unworkable enough. Reagan may not have been able to do everything he wanted to do, or those who came after him, but the machinery has not been unworkable enough to stop this onslaught. And that may be because we allowed it to build up such a head of steam that it takes more to stop it now. And we have all the historical precedents tell us how deadly the bourgeoisie is if it ever considers that its back is against the wall. I remember somebody making a warning like that back in, I think it was Erick Hobsbawm after the coup in Chile, saying, well, one thing this teaches us is how bloodthirsty the bourgeoisie is. And we haven't seen it yet in this country. We've seen blood, and we've seen bloodthirst, but we don't know how bloodthirsty they can become if we even look like mounting an effective opposition. But that's what we have to do. We might as well be ready for the fact, though, that it's not going to be a Sunday school picnic.
You said that Sanders represented unearned grace, and I think the take-home message might be that we can only be saved by works and not grace.
Yeah. Even if our work is the work of accepting grace. Yeah.
Indeed, as
work is what's required, but it has to be work informed by knowledge and understanding. And I think that's where you come in.
Barbara and Karen Fields, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, we enjoyed it, and
every minute
looking
of it.
Forward to talking to you again sometime.
Barbara Fields and Karen Fields are, amongst many other things, the co-authors of Racecraft from Verso Books. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said as he was pointing out that Hitler was a big fan of American eugenics and of American immigration law, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week, usually 2. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Follow us on Twitter at The Dig Radio, and please find us wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe. And if you're on iTunes, please take a moment to leave us a review. Those reviews somehow affect iTunes' secretive algorithms and help introduce us to new listeners. We gotta work the system that we have at the moment until we transform it. And if you haven't done so yet, please go to patreon.com/thedig and make a contribution. $5 a month is a huge help.